Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. So in today's video, I'm going to go from a bare gravel shed pad to a finished shed floor. I'm not a carpenter or an expert by any means. So this video is just for reference and entertainment purposes only. So there may be things in here that you can use for your project, or maybe you'll learn from some of the mistakes that I'm making and won't repeat them on your project. As you can see behind me, this is where the shed is going to go on this bed of gravel that I had put in last year. The shed is going to be 12 feet deep by 20 feet wide. Now, aside from the size, I don't have any of the details of the shed completely solidified yet. I'm not really working from a set plan. I'm kind of doing this all out of my head. I've got some lumber laid out on the driveway here and ready to go for building the shed base. So I plan for the floor of the shed to sit on 4x6 by 20 foot long stringers that are going to sit right on top of the crushed gravel shed pad. So this video is being recorded in July of 2021. We're still dealing with a little bit of shortages here and there on certain things. One of the things that I couldn't get a hold of easily was a 4x6 by 20 foot long stringer. So I'm going to build my own using 4x4s and 2x4s. But before I do, I want to mention that I probably could have gotten away with just putting two 2x6s back to back and screwing them together. The reason I didn't do that is, again, because of availability. I couldn't find ground contact 2x6s anywhere locally. So this is what I came up with. Now, it's not ideal, but for stringers, it should be fine. And then now you're going to have to hold it tight. I'm going to pull on it hard, okay? So hold it tight. And then what we do is we pick it up and snap it like that. So I've got two 4x4s laid out in the driveway. The one closest to me is a 12-footer, and the one closest to the camera is an 8-footer. And I've got them lined up roughly to my chalk line that we snapped on the driveway. So before setting these up, I also made sure that if there was any bow in the 4x4, it was down facing the driveway so that the hump is facing up. So next, I laid my 2x4s on top of the 4x4s. And the way I laid these out is I put the 12-footer over top of the 8-footer so the seams don't align. And then here's a look at the end of the 8-foot 2x4 lined up to the 12-foot 2x4. Now that I've got all the boards laid out the way that I want, I'm going to use some 2.5-inch exterior coated screws rated for pressure treated lumber and just attach the 2x4s to the 4x4s. You can probably see here on the end, I got a little too close to the edge of the board and it started to split a little bit. When I get near the ends on the other sections, I'll stay away from the ends a little bit more than I did here. But anyway, you get the idea here. I'm going to put screws every 16 inches or so, offset 8 inches so that I don't line up with where the floor joists are going to end up being when the floor is on top of these stringers. So once I started trying to move this thing around, I realized that this joint here where the two 4x4s come together was a little weak. So I cut a couple of short pieces of pressure treated 2x4 and screwed them in to reinforce the joint. And now I think we're good to go, and I'll just build the other 3 stringers. Now comes the tedious part. I need to get these things positioned so they're roughly 4 foot on center and parallel to each other and also level. The other thing I'll mention about the sleepers is that when I put them together, they were all 20 foot and roughly 1 inch long. And I realized I actually wanted them a little bit shorter than that so that when the shed is finished, they're just a little bit shorter than the 20-foot span of the shed so that I can put trim board under them if I want to hide them. So what I ended up doing is I cut all of them to 1 inch less than 20 feet or 239 inches. So the next thing I'm going to do is lay out the 20-foot long header joists for the floor. Now, again, because of availability issues, I couldn't get a single 20-foot long 2x4 anywhere. So I'm going to have to kind of stitch this thing together as I go along. May not be ideal, but it should work. So what you can see behind me are 4 boards. On this side, I've got a 12-footer and an 8-footer butted end to end. And on this side, I've got the 8-footer here and the 12-footer down there, butted end to end. Now, the reason I have them clamped together is because the boards are fairly wavy and bowed. So I oriented the boards so that the bows were both facing out and then clamped everything together so that everything is, well, as square as it's going to get anyway. So what I'm going to do now is lay out the position of all the joists on both of these boards so that way when they're separated and put up at the shed, everything should line up. So I've got my tape measure set up here so that I can mark out where the joists are going to go. Now the first joist, of course, is going to be at the end of the boards. So what I'm going to do is measure 1.5 inches over, make a mark, then I'll use my square to make sure I get a nice straight line, and then I'll mark off the side where the stud's going to go. So from here on out, each of the joists is going to be 16 inches on center. So what I'm going to do is go over to the 16-inch mark and then go back 3/4 of an inch and mark that spot. Then I'll use my square to draw a line again, and then I'll mark the side of the line that the joist is going to be placed on. So basically what I'm going to do now is just repeat the process every 16 inches down the line. So I've got all my joist locations marked out, but I wanted to point out here where I've got the seams in the header. I've marked each side so that I don't lose track. And I've also put arrows on the boards so I know which side I plan to have these on. These are going to be the front, and this one's going to be the back. The next thing I'm going to do is cut the joists to length. These 12-foot 2x4s are actually longer than 12 feet. They're actually 12 foot 3/8 inches long. So because the floor joists are going to sit between the two headers, I need to take off the 3 3/8 inch, the 3-inch to compensate for the thickness of the two header boards, and the extra 3/8 in length that's on this board. So for all 16 joists, the first thing I'm going to do is take and remove just a small amount of material from one end of each board. And the reason for that is to just make sure that they're all square and the same. This one actually looks pretty good if I slide the square over, but I'm not so sure all of them are as good as this one. So just to make sure they're all the same and square, I'll take a small amount off of one side. And then we'll take the bulk of the material off of the other side. And I've set up a stop block so I take the same amount off of each board. So as it turns out, these boards are not all exactly the same length. Now I've got one end all trimmed and squared up, and I double checked a few with the tape measure and they're all just a little bit off. That's okay. I'm just going to have to measure and cut each one individually rather than setting up a stop block like I did with the first side. So I'm using the cut or squared off end of the board as the starting point, and I'm measuring over 141 inches, which is 3 inches shy of 12 feet. So when I line this board up to cut it, I want to make sure that the blade is on the outer side of the line that I drew, and that way the end of the board will be exactly at the 141 inch mark. So this is the board that I first measured out and cut to 141 inches. I've marked it with an M now because it's now going to be the master, and what I'm going to do is overlay it to each one of these boards and use it to measure the length rather than my tape measure. If I use the tape measure to measure each one out 141 inches, I may end up with some variation depending on where I mark the line. So I'm hoping that this method will keep everything a little more uniform. As you can see behind me, I've got all the joists cut to length and roughly placed up here at the shed pad. So somebody out there that knows carpentry better than I can put it in the comments below, but these joists are bowed in both directions. And I don't remember which direction is called which, but there's a bow and a crown. So what that means is that I've got it set up so that the board is higher in the middle than it is at the ends, so that hopefully once the plywood and the weight of the shed is on here, it kind of flattens out. The boards are also bowed in this direction. And I've tried to set them up so that the bow is all the same, so that as I go along I can try and fix and straighten it so that when I put the plywood on, I've got something to screw into. So I'm going to start with this joist on the end first. I've got it lined up to my marks on the headers, and I'm just going to screw it in place. So now I'm going to go over to the opposite end and screw that joist in. At the two places where the headers come together, on the front and on the back, I'm going to attach a temporary piece of scrap wood just to hold everything together so it doesn't move around as I'm working. So at this point, I decided to square everything up before I attached any of the other joists. So I grabbed my tape measure, as you can see behind me there, and I measured each diagonal to get them as close as I could. And in my case, the measurement is 280 inches. Now, I know this thing is going to move around a little bit as I work, so I'm going to have to check this and adjust again, but for now, I'm going to start attaching the rest of the floor joists. I've got all the floor joists attached. Now it's time to do the final square up, positioning and then attaching the joists to the sleepers. So what I've done so far is to get the front header joist centered and aligned with the front sleeper. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to temporarily toenail that header into the sleeper so it can't move. So since all these joists are pretty bowed, I wanted to square up this first one and get it nice and straight, and then I can use this one as a baseline and measure out even spacing and toenail everything into the sleepers. Now I don't really have a long enough straight edge to kind of figure everything out, so I grabbed one of my pieces of plywood, squared it up to the front header, and then aligned this joist to this edge of the plywood. And I've also made sure that my sleepers have the same overhang on the joist as they do on the front and the back, and I adjusted their position with my persuader. And now I'm just going to lock this joist in place by toenailing it into the sleeper down below. So now that I have the first joist squared up, I can just grab my tape measure, put it roughly in the middle, and get the rest of these set to 16 inch on center and toenail them into the sleepers. So now that I've got all the joists pinned down to the sleepers, I decided to do one more measurement check to make sure I was square. And I'm getting 279 3/4 inches on both diagonals. Well, give or take a 1/16. So I'm in pretty good shape. So the last thing I need to do before I get the plywood mounted to the joists is to go through and fill in these low spots underneath my sleepers. So I'm going to grab a shovel and do that now. So now it's time to start putting down my plywood. You can see I've got my first sheet squared up to the front quarter here, and I've got it set up so that the bow that's in the plywood is facing up, so that as I screw it down, it'll pull itself down into the joists. So I've got the plywood lined up to the very corner, and I'm going to put one screw in to hold it in place. Now I'm going to stand on the board to help flatten it out, and I'm going to use my persuader to kind of tap it into place. So now that it's squared up with the end joist, I can put another screw in over here. I've got the first two 8-foot sheets of plywood screwed down to the floor. Now I'm at the end and I need to cut one to about 4 feet in length. So I double checked my measurements, and I'm actually going to need to cut this to about 47.5 inches because each of those sheets of plywood is about 1/4 inch longer than 8 feet. So I've got a piece of plywood over there ready to go, and I'm just going to cut that one in half. So to help myself cut a straighter line, I've first marked off the line that I want to cut on and put a little mark there so I know that's the right line to cut. And then what I did is I put my saw down on the line and I measured off the thickness of the fence here, and I made another line next to my cut line. Now what I'll do is mark that as well. And I'll grab this straight edge that I have and line it up to the second line. And I'll grab a couple clamps and clamp it down on the edge. And one last thing to note before I actually cut this is that I moved the board over so I'm straddling two of the joists, so I have free space underneath the saw so I don't cut into any of the joists. So I've got the piece positioned. Now I'll just screw it down and move on to the next row. So one other thing to mention as I get the second row started, I'm starting on this side with the 8-foot board that I'm not going to cut, and I'll wind up down on that side with the board that I will cut. And the reason I'm doing that is so that the seams don't line up on the joists, and that'll just add a little bit of extra strength to the floor. So as you can see behind me, the shed floor is done. So now I can move on to the next step. But before I do that, I'm going to play around a little bit here and see if I can finally decide where I want to put my shed doors, so that I can move towards finalizing the overall shed design a little bit further. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more videos in the shed building series or want to support my channel, check the links in the description below. Thanks for watching.